Welcome to my second talk on constructivism. I'm doing it in a t-shirt today because it's 34 degrees, a lovely summer day, but hot. My critique of constructivism, a very friendly critique, has two components to it. The first has to do with the focus of so many constructivists on identity as the primary source of political behavior. Some constructivists use identity as the kind of master variable comparable to what realists do with power. I think this is unwarranted for reasons that I will make clear. Second part of my critique has to do with the kinds of questions that constructivists ask. For many, the focus is constitution. How do actors become actors, recognized in the eyes of others? And with it come a set of expectations about how they should behave. For constructivists, the focus here is usually on the constitution of states. They're not autonomous, egoistic actors, but members of a society who have pressure to behave in certain ways as a result. Other constructivists are interested in the reasons that people have for acting as they do. This, of course, is not in any way unrelated to how they're constituted, because that brings with it certain socialization into values and goals. But the reasons that people have for acting, while important and a necessary corrective to realists who assume that they know already why people act, that is, on the basis of system constraints and opportunity, this focus nevertheless is inadequate for understanding outcomes of international politics, because they're the result of multiple actors interacting, producing what sometimes none of them expect or want. Well, let me have a sip of water given the heat, and proceed with the first part of the critique. Now, one of the reasons constructivism became such an important paradigm at the end of the Cold War was a perceived shift in the nature of political problems and the motives of political actors. Identity politics, so to speak, came to the fore. They're prominent domestically across the world, go away, and in international politics as well. Constructivism seemed a paradigm ideally suited for the study of identity politics. And this is appropriate and good. However, the mistake, I believe, is assuming that identity will actually tell you how people behave. And here I'm going to argue two things. One may sound radical to you, and this is the claim that we don't have identities. And secondly, that states have them even less than individuals. I'll give a separate talk on identity, so today I'm going to give a very abbreviated version of my argument, which goes as follows: that empirical research by psychologists and indeed by novelists, who are not relying on research but their insight into people, find that what people have are a large number of identifications. These identifications stem, for the most part, from our affiliations. So I think of myself as a husband and as a father, for example, from the roles that we perform, whether in the family or the society at large, from our relationship to our bodies, and finally from our autobiographies. And by this I mean not only our own life stories, but the narratives of groups with whom we identify, even nationalities and nations. These identifications are multiple. They're also labile. Their contents changes over time. They're rewritten, sometimes consciously, most often unconsciously. They rise and fall in importance over the course of days and years. And of equal importance here, they rise and fall as a function of context and priming. I'm in New Hampshire at the moment. If somebody comes up wearing a New York Yankees cap and asks me who I am, I will tell them I'm a member of the Red Sox Nation. If they should appear with a Donald Trump button, I will offer quite a different self-identification. In other words, what comes to the fore is a function of the situation that we confront. Now, these identifications are not hierarchical. They're a jumble, and on some days some may be more important or less important than others. And they may be quite conflicting. So I'm a friend with a student, particularly a postgraduate student. I feel I have responsibilities and want to act in a particular way towards friends, but I also am a professor, and that requires me to act in different ways toward the same student. This role on the one hand and this affiliation on the other may be in conflict, each telling me to do a different kind of thing. Now, to the extent that we have these multiple identifications, looking to them for either political or ethical guidance can only lead to an aporia. Because as situations change, they'll give us different kinds of guidance, depending on which identification is primary at a given moment. It may tell us to do something quite different, either politically or ethically. And of equal importance, leaders have lots of political wiggle room. So a research program like Ontological Security in Constructivism contends that states have identities, that leaders are rewarded for behaving in terms of those identities or enacting them, and can be punished for behaving in ways at odds with them. States don't have identities. So think of the difference between an individual and a state by recognizing that states have no psyches. They're not coherent beings the way individuals are. That whatever identities states have are what other people have imposed on them. Think of a state as resembling a refrigerator where my umbrella is moving and I'm hoping to block the sun with it. So we have a refrigerator in the house, and when the kids were young, they used to put magnets on it. So did we. And the magnets had designs or slogans or pictures on it that captured their particular interests at the moment. I still have one on my refrigerator from the University of Chicago, a magnet with a little C, and I have a magnetic small beer can opener in the shape of the Leaning Tower of Pisa that my youngest son gave me as a souvenir on his, intended as a joke, on his first trip to Italy. So refrigerators have no say over what gets attached to their outer walls. They're passive. So are states. And what much of politics is about are efforts by people to impose identities on states that are consistent with their political and psychological goals. They do this because to the extent they can get others to think of themselves in terms of that identity, they're more able to mobilize them in support of their respective projects. This is an inherently political process. As a result, states, like people, have multiple identities, and even these components of their identity tend to be thought of and defined or conceived quite differently by different actors. They're up for grabs. And you see this in political elections, particularly right now in the United States, where Donald Trump and Joseph Biden are offering very different understandings of what America is, both historically, in the present, and what it should be in the future, and who should be considered Americans of equal importance. So what we have are identifications that are advanced to serve political ends. Political leaders may try to build support by associating themselves with existing identities or encouraging new ones or new interpretations of it. This is a constant rewriting of collective identity, just the way individuals remake themselves and their images of themselves. Perhaps the best way of thinking about this is in the writing of George Herbert Mead, an American pragmatist philosopher who wrote at the end of the 19th and in the early part of the 20th century. And he distinguished between me and I. Me was the identity imposed on you by society, and the I was your effort to develop your own sense of self and express whom you thought you were. And me and I were always in conflict, and his view was the me tended to be dominant. So when we come to states, they don't have I's. They're only me's. And the struggle is not within the state or between the state and people, but entirely within the people who are attempting to impose and even enforce particular identities. So we need to think about identity in a more sophisticated way, to give up the notion that it can be any kind of master variable, and to recognize, perhaps even more importantly, that there are many frames of reference that people have in terms of which they act, and identity is only one. The second component of my critique concerns constitution and reasons people have for behaving. Constructivists have made a significant contribution to our literature by recognizing that actors are not born with identities or identifications, but rather they're associated with roles that they perform, that these roles are constituted by society, and actors are constituted in those roles, or many of them, by society. You want to be a fireman, you can't just say, I'm a fireman. To be a fireman, you have to work for a fire department or be a volunteer. Our little town has a volunteer fire department. And you have to be trained and tested, and you have a period of transition to prove yourself before you're accepted as a fireman or firewoman. Now, Constitution is important, and some constructivists think of it as something separate from causation. But there is good reason to believe that Constitution and causation are very closely related, because actors accept rule packages to which they must conform. That not only limits what they can do, but it emphasizes certain kinds of goals and ways of achieving it. That means that they're more likely to think and act in particular ways than they would otherwise. So Constitution has causal consequences, and we need to study more clearly the relationship between Constitution and causation to get a better handle on not only why people act the way they do, but the extent to which society is able to shape that behavior and the conditions in which people have more agency. And here, while constructivism confronts a problem, it also confronts a very fine opportunity to say something important about the respective roles of agency and structure and the complex ways in which they interact. My final point has to do with reasons people have for acting. For many constructivists, that's the form of knowledge they seek. They want to recreate the life world of the individual. By doing so, understand why they behave the way they do. This is essential and a very important antidote to structural arguments made by realists and liberals that assume that individuals behave in certain ways rather than actually studying how they behave. However, we're also interested in the outcomes of their behavior. These outcomes, as I noted at the beginning of my talk, are the product of multiple actors. Their interactions have a life of their own through a process of aggregation lead to particular outcomes. Knowing something about the reasons why people behave tells us nothing about the outcomes of their actions. We need another set of tools to address this fundamental problem of politics. Thank you.